The morning started with my driveway under siege, and HOA Karen was the one who put it there. I stepped out with coffee in my hand and saw her $70,000 SUV stretched sideways across my private drive, like a barricade meant to humiliate, not a mistake meant to be fixed. It wasn't careless parking, and it wasn't temporary. It was deliberate, calculated, and placed to deny me access to my own land. HOA Karen had decided that day to test authority on my property. She didn't knock, call, or ask. She blocked my driveway and waited for me to submit. That single act told me everything about her intent. She wanted a public win and a private surrender. She thought I would beg or explode. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I stood there in the cold air with steam rising from my mug and let the moment settle without reacting. The quiet of my land made the intrusion louder than any shout she could have managed. Chrome reflected the early light, the SUV's polished surface screaming confidence and entitlement. HOA Karen hadn't just crossed a boundary, she had marked it like she owned it. This wasn't a misunderstanding waiting for clarification. It was a message delivered in steel and arrogance. She believed my driveway was just another square on her board, another space she could claim with rules and pressure. What she didn't understand was that this was the one place where her authority ended completely. That vehicle didn't belong to a visitor who got lost, or a neighbor who parked wrong by accident. It belonged to HOA Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of our homeowners association, and the loudest voice in every meeting. Mid-50s, immaculate hair, clipboard always in reach. She carried herself like the neighborhood owed her obedience. For months she'd been orbiting my property, circling with notices, warnings, and thinly veiled threats. She complained about my tractor being an eyesore. She nitpicked my mailbox color. She tried to fine me because my American flag was, in her words, excessive. Each time I answered calmly, legally, and without drama, and each time she escalated. Blocking my driveway was her boldest move yet, a gamble that relied entirely on intimidation. I walked closer, not rushing, not stopping. My steps measured the way they always are when I assess a problem. Tucked beneath her windshield wiper was a note, written boldly enough to be read from a distance. You don't use this driveway enough, so I'm borrowing it today. Deal with it. There was no apology in that message, and no ambiguity. It was an admission wrapped in arrogance, and she didn't even realize it. She had documented her own trespass with her handwriting. HOA Karen believed rules existed for everyone else, and that belief was about to cost her. By then, the neighbors had noticed. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and phones appeared in hands that had stayed quiet for years. Whispers moved faster than I did, carrying the same question from yard to yard. What is she doing now? HOA Karen wanted witnesses because she thought witnesses would make me fold. She expected me to walk over, knock on her door, and ask her to move like a man afraid of conflict. She wanted the performance, the submission, the story she could tell later. What she didn't expect was silence. Instead of anger, a cold calm settled over me, the kind that arrives when patterns finally complete themselves. My name is Jackson Cole, and I don't confuse noise with power. I've spent decades working land, machinery, and law, and those three things teach you the same lesson. Control belongs to whoever understands leverage, not whoever yells the loudest. On my property sits more than gravel and asphalt. It sits a tractor built to move earth, trees, and anything else that doesn't belong where it stands. HOA Karen saw that tractor as an eyesore. I saw it as a tool that answered problems decisively. I took another sip of coffee and let the steam roll across my face. She thought she had disrupted my routine, but all she had done was trigger it. The quiet homeowner she'd fined and mocked was no longer a background character in her story. The note on her windshield wasn't just rude, it was evidence. The SUV wasn't just expensive, it was trespassing. And the morning she tried to embarrass me was about to become the moment her authority cracked in public. People like HOA Karen believe intimidation is the same thing as control. They rely on the assumption that no one will challenge them openly. They escalate slowly, conditioning others to retreat so that when they finally overreach, they expect the same result. She believed blocking my driveway would force me into a corner. She believed the value of her vehicle would protect her from consequences. She believed her title carried weight on land she didn't own. Every one of those beliefs was wrong. I didn't shout across the yard or wave my arms to draw attention. I didn't confront her door or demand she move the SUV. I let the situation exist exactly as she created it, because that clarity mattered. Her decision needed to be seen, not argued. Her arrogance needed to stand in the open long enough to gather witnesses. The longer that SUV sat across my driveway, the heavier it became for her. As the neighborhood watched, something subtle shifted. This wasn't just my problem anymore. It was a visible act of overreach that everyone could understand without explanation. No bylaws needed quoting, and no meetings needed scheduling. A driveway was blocked, and the person who blocked it had left a note bragging about it. HOA Karen had turned her pattern of abuse into a public display. I set my mug down on the hood of my truck and looked at the machine waiting in my barn. She thought she was daring me to react emotionally. She didn't know I was already deciding how this would end. This wasn't about revenge or temper. It was about restoring a boundary she believed didn't apply to her. And once that boundary was enforced, everything else about her authority would unravel on its own. The street stayed quiet as I turned away from the SUV. No one laughed yet, and no one intervened. The tension sat heavy because everyone sensed something irreversible was coming. HOA Karen had placed her confidence in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had chosen my driveway as the stage for her dominance. She had no idea it would become the place where she lost it. HOA Karen didn't just wake up one morning and decide to block my driveway, and I didn't wake up suddenly capable of dealing with someone like her. What collided that morning were two long-running trajectories, hers built on unchecked petty authority, and mine built on discipline, documentation, and a refusal to be managed by intimidation. Long before that SUV touched my gravel, I had already learned how small tyrants operate, how they test boundaries, and how they crumble when those boundaries stop moving. I bought this property after decades of living by procedure, not suggestion. Years of work taught me that systems only protect people who understand them, and that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. I didn't come here looking for conflict or influence. I came here to own my land, mind my business, and live without someone else dictating how I exist on property I paid for. That quiet independence was exactly what drew HOA Karen's attention. From the moment my name appeared on her list, she treated me like a problem that needed managing. It started with polite-looking letters that carried sharp undertones, reminders about compliance and community image. When those didn't change anything, the tone shifted. Warnings became citations, suggestions became threats, and everything was framed as if she were doing me a favor by enforcing standards. Each notice assumed I would either panic or fold. I did neither. Every time she sent something, I responded the same way. Calm documentation, photos, dates, copies of the covenants she claimed to enforce. I highlighted the sections that applied and ignored the ones that didn't. I never argued emotionally and never raised my voice. That infuriated her more than defiance ever could. Silence backed by paperwork is kryptonite to people who rely on bluster. Around the neighborhood, her reputation was already established. People spoke about her carefully, choosing words the way you choose steps on ice. Retirees paid fines they didn't deserve because fighting felt exhausting. Families repainted walls and tore down small projects because arguing felt risky. She thrived on that exhaustion. The fewer people pushed back, the more confident she became that no one ever would. I watched all of it without stepping in, not because I was afraid, but because timing matters. Authority figures like HOA Karen hang themselves with patterns, not single acts. You don't interrupt that process early. You let it mature until the behavior is undeniable, until it becomes visible even to those who benefit from looking away. Every letter she sent me added another layer to the record. Every escalation she chose narrowed her options. My land reflects how I think. Clean lines, clear boundaries, equipment maintained to exact standards, cameras positioned where they matter, logs kept not out of paranoia, but out of habit. When you've spent years accountable for outcomes, you learn to anticipate accusations before they're made. HOA Karen mistook that preparation for weakness because she didn't understand it. She believed power came from being seen. I knew it came from being ready. By the time she blocked my driveway, the imbalance between us was already set. She was escalating outward, relying on spectacle and intimidation. I was escalating inward, building structure and proof. Her authority depended on people assuming she couldn't be challenged. Mine depended on knowing exactly when to act. That morning wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable moment when her confidence finally outran her protection. As I stood there looking at her SUV, I wasn't reliving past grievances or planning revenge. I was recognizing completion. Months of quiet restraint had led here. The difference between us wasn't anger or ego. It was that I understood consequences as something you prepare for, not something you threaten. HOA Karen believed she was in control because no one had stopped her before. She didn't realize that stopping her didn't require noise. It required certainty. That certainty is what carried me through the next step. Not adrenaline, not pride, just the understanding that once someone like her crosses a line in full view, the outcome stops being optional. HOA Karen's power never came from respect, and it never came from competence. It came from fear, confusion, and the slow conditioning of a neighborhood that had been taught, year after year, that resistance was more expensive than compliance. She didn't rule by charisma or consensus. She ruled by paperwork, timing, and selective punishment. And she understood exactly how to apply pressure without ever getting her hands dirty. She positioned herself at the center of everything early on. Board meetings, email chains, rule revisions, enforcement notices, all of it flowed through her. She spoke the language of procedure fluently enough to sound legitimate, but what she actually practiced was control through ambiguity. Rules were written vaguely on purpose. Enforcement was inconsistent by design. That way no one ever knew if they were safe or next. Uncertainty was her strongest weapon. At meetings, she performed. When outsiders or cameras were present, her tone softened and her words were careful. All community spirit and shared values. Once those protections disappeared, so did the mask. She spoke sharply, cut people off, and framed dissent as ignorance or selfishness. Anyone who questioned her interpretation of the bylaws was labeled difficult. Anyone who pushed back too hard found themselves buried in violations weeks later. She built loyalty the same way she built fear. Some residents were ignored completely, their violations overlooked as long as they stayed friendly and quiet. Others were targeted relentlessly for the smallest infractions. The message was clear even if it was never spoken aloud. Fall in line and disappear. Step out and become an example. That kind of selective enforcement doesn't just punish individuals, it trains the entire group to self-police on her behalf. I saw how people changed around her. Conversation stopped when she walked by. Neighbors who once waved started watching their words. Complaints were whispered, not written. People learned that formal channels led straight back to her desk, and nothing good ever came from that. She didn't need to threaten openly anymore. Her reputation did the work for her. She loved the symbols of authority, the clipboard, the printed notices, the official-looking envelopes taped to doors. None of it had real power on its own, but together it created the illusion that she was untouchable. Most people never tested that illusion because the cost of being wrong felt too high. That's how she stayed in control for so long, not by being right, but by being unchallenged. Her abuse wasn't loud. It was procedural. It arrived in the form of fines that made no sense, deadlines that shifted without notice, and interpretations of rules that changed depending on who was involved. If someone complied quickly, the pressure eased. If they questioned her, the pressure doubled. Over time, people learned to comply without asking why. The board enabled her, whether they admitted it or not. Some were afraid of her. Some benefited from her favoritism. Most simply didn't want the attention. She dominated meetings, controlled agendas, and framed decisions so that disagreement looked unreasonable. By the time votes were taken, the outcome was already decided. Anyone who objected did so alone. Blocking my driveway wasn't an accident or a lapse in judgment. It was the logical extension of how she'd always operated. She believed her authority was portable, that it followed her wherever she went. She assumed that if she acted boldly enough, no one would question her, even when she stepped onto land she didn't own. That assumption had been reinforced for years by people backing down. What she failed to understand was that systems built on fear collapse the moment fear stops working. The moment someone doesn't flinch, the entire structure starts to wobble. She thought the driveway was just another place she could assert dominance. She didn't see it as a boundary. She saw it as a challenge. That was her mistake, because the more she relied on intimidation, the more evidence she created. Every selective fine, every threatening letter, every public shaming added to a pattern that couldn't be explained away. And once that pattern became visible in the open, once it was no longer confined to whispered complaints and closed meetings, her power stopped being abstract. By choosing to block my driveway in broad daylight, she took everything she'd been doing quietly and put it on display. She didn't just challenge me. She exposed herself to a neighborhood that was already tired, already watching, and waiting for proof that she could be stopped. The moment I recognized what HOA Karen had done, my response shifted from observation to documentation, because intent matters and proof decides everything. I didn't raise my voice or approach her door. I reached for my phone and began recording the situation exactly as it existed, untouched and undeniable. Wide shots first, showing her SUV stretched across the full width of my private driveway. Close-ups next, capturing the license plate, the angle of the tires, the way the bumper crossed the boundary markers I had installed years earlier. Every photo carried a timestamp. Every angle reinforced the same fact. She had obstructed my access deliberately. I photographed the note under her windshield with care, making sure the handwriting was clear and the message readable. There was no need to dramatize it. Her words did that on their own. The phrasing wasn't frustrated or apologetic. It was confident, dismissive, and possessive. She had written it expecting compliance, not consequence. That note locked her intent into the record in a way no argument ever could. As neighbors gathered, I made no effort to control the narrative. I simply let the scene exist. People stepped closer on their own, phones raised, curiosity replacing fear. I asked simple questions out loud, questions anyone could answer without choosing sides. Is my driveway blocked? Did you see her vehicle here before I came outside? Heads nodded. Voices confirmed. Witnesses don't need persuasion when the facts are obvious. Inside my shop, I already had what most people scramble to assemble after things go wrong. A folder labeled Karen's name, built slowly over time, held every letter she had sent, every fine she had threatened, every email where her tone shifted depending on who she was addressing. I had meeting minutes showing selective enforcement. I had recordings of her public statements contradicting her private directives. She believed authority erased memory. It actually creates a trail. I opened my laptop long enough to verify the one thing that would matter if this escalated. State law on obstruction of ingress and egress. Private residential property. Trespass. The language was clear and unambiguous. I cross-referenced it with the HOA covenants she loved to quote. Nowhere did they grant her the authority to block a homeowner's driveway. I captured those pages too, highlighting the absence rather than arguing about interpretation. Before any machinery moved, I documented that as well. Photos of the tractor, clean forks, no damage, no modifications. It wasn't paranoia. It was foresight. Accusations travel faster than truth, and I had no intention of letting her invent damage that didn't exist. Every step I took closed another escape route for her narrative. The longer the SUV sat there, the heavier the proof became. This wasn't a momentary lapse that could be reframed later. It was a sustained act of obstruction, witnessed, recorded, and confirmed. HOA Karen was still inside her house at that point, unaware that the situation had already shifted beyond her control. She believed the power struggle would begin when she confronted me. In reality, it had already ended on paper. By the time I finished documenting, there was nothing left to clarify. Every relevant fact was captured. Every potential accusation had a counterpoint waiting. The situation no longer belonged to emotion or opinion. It belonged to sequence, evidence, and law. All that remained was action, and that action would not be loud or reckless. It would be precise, public, and impossible to undo. By the time I walked back toward the barn, the tension had thickened into something everyone could feel, but no one wanted to name. The SUV still sat there like a challenge, its polished body catching the morning light, as if it were proud of what it was doing. Neighbors had stopped pretending they were just passing by. They stood in clusters now, phones openly raised, conversations low and cautious. HOA Karen had wanted an audience, and without realizing it, she had built one far larger than she could control. When the tractor engine turned over, the sound cut through the cul-de-sac with a low, steady rumble that pulled every remaining door open. This wasn't the roar of anger or the chaos of a tantrum. It was mechanical, controlled, and patient. Gravel shifted under heavy tires as I eased the machine forward, forks lowering slowly, deliberately, in a way that made clear nothing about this was rushed. The tractor didn't lunge or jerk. It advanced the way consequences do when they're finally allowed to move. That was when HOA Karen appeared. Her front door flew open and she stormed out in a bathrobe, hair unfinished, confidence already cracking under the weight of what she was seeing. She shouted before she reached the driveway, her voice sharp and panicked, calling attention to the value of her SUV as if money itself were a shield. She waved her arms and demanded I stop, as though authority still lived in her tone. It didn't. Not anymore. I didn't shout back. I didn't even raise my voice. I leaned slightly out of the cab and told her exactly what was happening. She had blocked my driveway. She had left a note admitting it. I was removing the obstruction from my property. I gave her a chance to move it herself, not as a courtesy, but as a final confirmation of her choice. She refused, doubling down on threats, insisting she was untouchable, insisting she was the HOA. The forks slid under the frame of her SUV with a sound that made the crowd gasp all at once. Steel met steel, and suddenly her $70,000 symbol of power was no longer resting comfortably on the pavement. I lifted slowly, just enough for the front tires to leave the ground. For a moment, everything froze. Phones steadied. Conversation stopped. HOA Karen stared at her vehicle, disbelief finally overtaking anger. She threatened arrest. She threatened lawsuits. She promised fines and consequences that no longer meant anything. So I finished the motion. The tractor tipped forward, controlled and steady, guiding the SUV toward the drainage ditch that ran along my property line. Mud splashed, tires sank, the vehicle settled at an angle that stripped it of every ounce of authority it had carried seconds earlier. It wasn't destroyed, it was displaced, helpless, and very publicly humbled. Her scream tore through the quiet, high and raw, nothing like the composed enforcer people were used to seeing. I shut the tractor down, climbed out, and walked away from the scene as if the problem had already been resolved. Behind me, laughter broke through the tension for the first time. Someone made a comment about needing a tow truck. Someone else suggested she borrow a bigger tractor next time. The sound wasn't cruel. It was relieved. Board members arrived late, clipboards in hand, confusion etched across their faces. One tried to posture, telling me this wasn't how disputes were handled. I asked him calmly whether blocking a homeowner's driveway was part of their enforcement process. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The murmurs around him grew louder as people realized the question didn't need explaining. When the police cruiser pulled in, lights flashing, the atmosphere tightened again, but it didn't scatter. Everyone stayed. Cameras kept recording. HOA Karen rushed the officers, tears appearing on cue, accusations tumbling over each other without structure. She painted herself as the victim, her voice rising with every word. The officers listened, then turned to me. I explained without embellishment. Blocked driveway, handwritten note, private property, documented removal, no contact, no threats. I handed over the note. One officer read it, raised an eyebrow, and showed it to his partner. Their posture shifted in a way that didn't favor her. They asked a few clarifying questions, looked at the position of the SUV, and then looked back at HOA Karen. They told her she had trespassed. They told her obstructing access to private property was illegal. One of them remarked that I could have had the vehicle towed instead. He described what I did as creative, not criminal. The crowd reacted before he could finish the sentence, laughter and commentary spilling out without restraint. Even the board members couldn't find words to counter it. HOA Karen's authority collapsed in that moment, not with a gavel or a vote, but with witnesses. Her threats lost weight. Her voice lost credibility. She stood there, surrounded by people who were no longer afraid of her, watching her power drain away in real time. What she had built over years unraveled in minutes, because it had never been solid to begin with. Once the crowd dispersed and the noise faded, what remained was process. And process is where people like HOA Karen lose every time. I didn't savor the spectacle or trade stories with neighbors. I went inside and began formalizing what had already happened, because humiliation on the street only matters if it becomes consequence on paper. While emotions cooled, records hardened. That distinction is where retaliation stops being personal and starts being permanent. I filed my police report the same day, attaching every photo, timestamp, and witness name in the order events unfolded. There was no exaggeration and no commentary, just sequence. Obstruction, trespass, documentation, removal. The officers who had been on scene recognized the clarity immediately. There was nothing to debate and nothing to reinterpret. HOA Karen's accusations were reduced to unsupported claims the moment they were written down next to verifiable facts. Within days, a certified letter went out to the HOA, not posturing or threatening, but citing violations in the same dry language HOA Karen had used against others for years. Trespass onto private property, obstruction of ingress and egress, harassment through repeated escalation. Each point referenced statutes and covenants, not emotion. My attorney prepared the civil action alongside it, outlining damages, legal fees, and an injunction to prevent any future interference. It wasn't aggressive. It was unavoidable. HOA Karen tried to pivot by filing an insurance claim on her SUV, framing the incident as vandalism. That narrative collapsed the moment adjusters asked the first obvious question. Why was the vehicle parked on private property without permission? The note under her windshield reappeared then, not as a joke or taunt, but as an admission. Her own handwriting undercut her claim more effectively than any argument I could have made. Inside the HOA, panic replaced confidence. Board members who had relied on her certainty suddenly saw personal exposure. Emergency meetings were called without her. Emails flew back and forth asking questions no one had dared to ask before. Why was she allowed to escalate this far? Why was enforcement so selective? Why were complaints ignored? The same structure that once shielded her began isolating her instead. The board's insurer moved quickly once formal notice was received. Rather than risk discovery, they pushed for settlement, covering damages and legal fees, while distancing themselves from HOA Karen personally. Coverage for intentional misconduct became a problem she couldn't avoid. For the first time, consequences weren't abstract or deferred. They were immediate and expensive. Her removal from leadership happened without drama. A procedural vote, a brief announcement, access revoked, titles stripped. The board framed it as routine, but everyone knew it wasn't. HOA Karen went from issuing orders to being excluded entirely, and that silence hit harder than any public rebuke. Authority doesn't survive when it loses access. She tried to bluff afterward, sending emails hinting at lawsuits and retaliation. Each one died quickly, answered with documentation, or not answered at all. The file on her was complete now. There was nothing left to argue, and nowhere left to escalate. The systems she believed she controlled had finished their work. By the end of that phase, HOA Karen wasn't an adversary anymore. She was a liability being managed and minimized. Her power didn't end with a bang or a verdict. It ended with doors quietly closing in sequence, one after another, until there was nowhere left for her to stand. The end with an announcement or a final confrontation, and that was the most fitting outcome of all. There was no dramatic meeting, no speech, no moment where HOA Karen stood up to explain herself. She simply stopped being present. Her name disappeared from emails. Her chair at meetings stayed empty. Decisions were made without her input, and no one bothered to ask why. Authority that once demanded attention now couldn't even secure acknowledgement. The neighborhood changed in ways so subtle they would have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't lived under pressure. Cars parked without worry about notices appearing on windshields. Decoration stayed up an extra day without consequences. People spoke more freely in passing, not loudly or defiantly, just without caution. Fear didn't explode into rebellion. It dissolved into normal life, and that quiet return to normality said more than any celebration could have. No one crowned a new ruler, and no one filled the vacuum with another tyrant. The board functioned with restraint, aware now of how fragile authority becomes when it forgets its limits. Rules were discussed instead of imposed. Enforcement slowed, then stabilized, then became almost invisible. That invisibility was the point. Control lost its grip because it no longer needed to prove itself. As for HOA Karen, she retreated completely. She avoided shared spaces and stopped trying to reassert herself through messages or intermediaries. The confidence that once fueled her actions had nowhere left to stand. Without fear to feed on and without access to enforce, she faded into the background she had spent years denying others. I didn't step into leadership or offer guidance. I didn't attend meetings or involve myself in decisions that weren't mine to make. My role ended when the boundary was restored. The driveway stayed clear after that. No one tested it. No one questioned it. The space she had tried to claim remained exactly what it had always been, mine. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, I stood where her SUV had once blocked my path. The gravel was undisturbed. The air was quiet. Nothing marked the spot, except the absence of conflict. That absence was enough. There was no lesson to deliver and no statement to make. Everything that needed to be understood had already been demonstrated. HOA Karen went silent.